This video is kindly sponsored by Masterworks. Find out more later on. Hey, 42 here. It's believed there are at least 100 billion planets in the Milky Way, the galaxy we call home. That's one hell of a lot of planets in just one galaxy. Now, if you take into account that some studies have estimated there could be up to 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, then it surely isn't beyond the realms of possibility that one of those planets might be home to an alien civilization not too dissimilar to our own. Unfortunately, getting up there and having a good look around is far beyond the realms of the technology that we currently have at our disposal. At present, piloted space exploration is seemingly limited to a few billionaires using it as their own personal playground, and more importantly, to see who has the largest and sturdiest rocket. But what if there is an alien civilization out there with technology far exceeding our own, and they've already been here over 70 years ago? Well, if the residents of Roswell, New Mexico are to be believed, that's exactly what happened in 1947, when an extraterrestrial flying saucer, along with its alien passengers, is said to have been recovered by the US government after crash landing into the desert. The event would come to be known as the Roswell Incident, and it's considered by many to be the largest government cover-up of all time. If you've long been hoping to wake up one day and find an almost priceless Banksy artwork has been painted on the side of your house, then you probably already know there's enormous value in art. The total wealth that is held in art is estimated to be worth $1.7 trillion. And now, thanks to Masterworks.io, you can invest in the very same exclusive art collections that the world's billionaires already invest in. When it comes to selling art, Masterworks knows what they're doing. They actually returned 32% to their investors in 2020 by selling a work by Banksy. And it's super easy to get involved. In just a few clicks, you can visit their website, create an account, browse their artwork, then diversify your portfolio with one of the most stable assets around. In fact, contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 total return by 174% from 1995 to 2020, according to publicly available data. Masterworks also operates a secondary market on their website, so if you don't want to wait until they find a buyer for a piece, you can actually sell yours to another member. If you want to take advantage and invest in fine art, there is currently a waiting list. However, you can actually skip that wait list and immediately start investing now by clicking the link in the description below. And it also really helps to support my channel. To find out what really happened at Roswell all those years ago, we're going to have to wade through deception that leads to deception, covered up with a red herring by a bunch of folk who seem rather deceptive. Yeah, this one's a strange one, so strap yourselves in for some classic mystery. Oh, and did I mention deception? On the 24th of June 1947, amateur pilot Kenneth Arnold was flying solo over the scenic landscapes of Mineral in Washington. Arnold had been hoping to find the wreckage of a plane that he thought had crash-landed in the area and claim a reward for solving the mystery of its disappearance. Although he never found said plane wreck, he witnessed something during that flight that sparked a nationwide obsession with unidentified flying objects. Arnold claims to have seen a bright bluish light flash across the sky, followed closely by 9 flying objects traveling in unison at breakneck speeds and maneuvering in ways that were thought impossible, even by the most advanced military aircraft of the time. Later, when Arnold was interviewed by the press, he described the objects as moving like saucers being skimmed across a lake. And it seems that this fairly innocuous description was misinterpreted, and some assumed Arnold was actually describing the shape of the objects themselves. The following day, news of his sighting was plastered across the front pages with a novel phrase that would embed itself in popular culture from that day on. Flying saucer. Arnold's UFO sighting was one of the first to be recorded in post-war America, and his position as a well-respected businessman meant few people questioned the authenticity of his story. The news spread like wildfire and would spark hundreds of copycat sightings. Before you knew it, barely a day passed by without somebody claiming to have seen something flying around in the sky that looked as though it had arrived from another planet. Whether there was indeed a raft of UFO visitors around that time, or people were just getting a bit jittery about post-war nuclear tensions between the US and the Soviets, so extra attention was being paid to strange objects in the skies, is unknown. But what we do know is that this mass paranoia was about to come to a head outside a small city in the New Mexico desert called Roswell. A few weeks after Arnold's flying saucers had entered the American consciousness, a rancher by the name of Mac Brazel was traveling roughly 80 miles northwest of Roswell when he spotted something a little different to the endless sand and tumbleweeds that he was so used to. There, on the ground in front of him, was what Brazel described as a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, and rather tough paper and sticks. Which, I'll be honest, sounds more like the materials a dodgy landlord would use to fix his tenant's boiler, rather than intergalactic transportation apparatus. He informed the sheriff of his discovery. The sheriff reported it to a nearby Air Force base. From there, the news worked its way up the chain of military command until it arrived at the desk of intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marshall, who was given the assignment of visiting the crash site and recovering any materials he found. Marshall had played a significant role in the atomic bomb test that the American military had carried out in Bikini Atoll. Presumably, this made him an authority figure on futuristic technology falling out of the sky. However, Marshall seemed as perplexed by the wreckage as Brazel had been. The wreckage was recovered and further examined, and a short time later, the Air Force issued a press release stating that they were now in possession of a mysterious flying disc that had crash-landed in New Mexico. Unsurprisingly, this only served to stoke the UFO fire that was raging across the country. The following day, the Roswell Daily Record published news of the wreckage, along with the sensational headline, "RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." Okay, so headlines weren't quite as snappy back then, and they didn't include the mandatory pun, but it was enough to send the locals into a frenzy. Now, I should point out that flying saucer didn't actually mean the Air Force were admitting the wreckage was of extraterrestrial origin, simply that they had recovered the wreckage of an unknown flying object. Nevertheless, releasing a statement that strongly implied they were in possession of a UFO probably wasn't the smartest move. As you can imagine, there were quite a few people further up the military command that were less than happy with how Brazel's discovery was being handled. And pretty soon, shadowy moves were being made to contain the hype that was building around the incident. A military superior named General Roger Ramey requested that the wreckage be brought to him so he could see for himself whether or not aliens were indeed planning on invading Earth by strategically smashing their very expensive spaceships into some sand. And of course, when he finally laid eyes on this enigmatic wreckage, it was rather unassuming. In fact, it looked exactly how Brazel had first identified it. Bits of rubber, tape, foil, and wood. The Air Force released another statement, this time claiming the wreckage belonged to a weather balloon. This was closely followed by the Roswell Daily Record issuing an apology for maybe jumping the gun a little. And finally, the man who discovered the wreckage, Mac Brazel, told everyone that he felt a little bit silly for the trouble he'd caused and expressed his regret at reporting the wreckage in the first place. And so, with all those loose ends, suspiciously but conveniently tied up, America seemed to completely forget about the Roswell incident and instead turned its attention to fast food munching clowns, Elvis Presley's gyrating hips, nuclear-powered cars, and scantily clad women in buddy girl outfits. Yeah, the 50s were a strange decade. Roswell, it appeared, was an open and shut case. Indeed, Roswell was forgotten about for 30 long years. Until, in the 70s, a nuclear physicist and professional ufologist, apparently that's a thing, by the name of Stanton Friedman, decided to revisit the Roswell incident, and he quickly realized some underhanded cards had been played by some very powerful and mysterious people back in 1947. As he would soon find out, there was much more to the Roswell incident than the American public had been told. Friedman began his investigations by interviewing Jesse Marcel, the Air Force major who'd been one of the first people to visit the crash site. Now, you might have expected Marcel to simply corroborate the official story. However, what Marcel told Friedman was simply out of this world. Marcel claimed that back in 1947, he'd been ordered to stay quiet about what had really crash-landed in Roswell. He told Friedman that amongst the wreckage was a strange, foil-like material. Marcel had handled this material himself, and he recounted how it was completely weightless and extremely thin. But the strangest thing was that he was unable to bend it, no matter how hard he tried. This sliver of material was also completely impervious to dents or scratches. And Marcel was a man who knew his metals. In his role as military intelligence officer, he knew every material that was used to construct aircraft. And this mysterious substance was totally unlike any of them. He could only conclude that this material, and hence whatever had crash-landed in the desert, was not from this planet. Naturally, at this point, Friedman was salivating for more information, and he continued to interview over 100 Roswell residents and first-hand witnesses of the incident. Not only did many of them verify Marcel's claims, but some said they had even seen alien bodies being recovered from the crash site. After Friedman published his findings, interest in the Roswell incident was reignited. As the years passed, conspiracy theories surrounding the incident garnered global attention, and the town itself turned into a sort of extraterrestrial Disneyland, with UFO stores and themed cafes and bars littering the desert landscape. My personal favorite is the Roswell branch of McDonald's. Oh, Ronald, you witty bastard. Over the decade, Roswell fever continued to grow until, in 1994, it was blown wide open. The official government files of the incident were declassified and made available to the public. Unbelievably, the documents revealed that Roswell was in fact a cover-up. But don't get too excited, because the official record states that the weather balloon alibi was made up by the military to deflect attention away from a top-secret research program underway during the Roswell crash back in the late 1940s. This program was called Project Mogul, and its goal was to create a high-altitude covert listening device that could detect nuclear missile launches from thousands of miles away in seconds. You see, post-war America was a country gripped by paranoia. Global powers were in the process of being redivided and redistributed, a tense situation that was made even more precarious by the small matter of nuclear bombs now being a thing. America, of course, had dropped 2 of them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so it was no secret the US had the ability to produce nuclear weapons. But as yet, it was completely unknown whether or not Russia had managed to successfully harness this devastating power. A concept which, to put it mildly, made America feel slightly queasy. And this is where Project Mogul came in. Project Mogul aspired to send microphones up into the stratosphere using high-altitude balloons, similar to weather balloons, and then use those microphones to detect sound waves caused by Soviet atomic bomb tests. It was based on the fact that underwater microphones were already being used at the time to detect explosions from great distances across the oceans. The balloons used in Project Mogul were enormous, far larger than normal weather balloons, and made from a durable polyethylene plastic that could have easily been misidentified as something otherworldly when discovered by a humble rancher making his way across the desert. The balloons were also fitted out with highly sophisticated and state-of-the 1940s art microphones and radio transmitters, which, to the untrained eye, could have given the appearance of advanced intergalactic debris. Now, that all sounds fairly plausible. Project Mogul and its high-tech balloons were a real thing at the time, and they just so happened to have been tested in the desert right outside Roswell. But then, it does seem rather ironic and blissfully convenient that the whole weather balloon cover-up story turned out to be a cover-up for, well, just another weather balloon, only a slightly fancier one. It's as if in 1994 the government suddenly needed a cover-up for their cover-up, and thought we'd all be easily duped by saying, "Hey, don't look at those bog-standard weather balloons over there. We made those up. It was actually one of these fancy weather balloons that crashed in the desert, and totally not a UFO." If you believe the declassified documents, then they explain the wreckage, and they sort of flimsily explain the unusual materials found at the site. But what about the alien bodies that witnesses claim to have seen in the desert? Well, in 1997, the US government released a report explaining that crash test dummies had been used to test the effects of parachutes on human beings by quite literally dropping the dummies from aeroplanes over several designated drop zones, one of which happened to be Roswell, New Mexico. The sight of these dummies being pulled out of the sand by government officials could easily have given the appearance of an alien body being retrieved from a crash site, especially given the UFO hysteria that was whirling around at the time. However, there is one small problem with this explanation. Those tests weren't carried out until the 1950s, years after the Roswell incident had taken place. When the government were asked about this discrepancy, they simply explained it away as people misremembering the details of their own sightings, which all sounds a little too Men in Black, if you ask me. Today, the Roswell incident is probably the most famous close counter conspiracy in human history. And, unfortunately, we still don't have an answer as to what crashed into the deserts that day in 1947. Every way you turn, there's a different conspiracy to get lost in. Or you could simply believe the official pimped out weather balloon and chucking people out of planes version of events. But before you do, let me just leave you with this. Many decades later, when documents concerning the Roswell incident were requested, it was discovered that all the key military documents in the months immediately surrounding the crash were, at some point, mysteriously destroyed. And the creepiest part? Nobody knows why they were destroyed or by whom. So today, all we have are the time-worn words of eyewitness accounts and very little else. But whoever you believe, one thing is clear. Somebody or something out there doesn't want us to know what really happened a little over 70 years ago in Roswell, New Mexico. Thanks for watching.